Hello everyone, enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
A young, poor girl was forced to marry an older, wealthy man. When she arrived at the mansion and met his son, she was immediately shocked. Claudia stared at herself in the mirror, unable to recognize the woman looking back. The reflection showed a perfect bride, with a white dress that fit flawlessly, a veil carefully placed, and makeup highlighting her youth and beauty. But behind that flawless image was a storm of emotions she couldn't control. She had never imagined her life would come to this. As Claudia's hands slightly trembled over the bouquet, memories of how she got here flooded her mind. Just a year ago, she dreamt of a future filled with love with Adrian, her first love. But those dreams shattered when he left her without an explanation, choosing another woman. That betrayal broke her heart, and in that pain, she decided to marry Anthony. "Claudia, are you ready?" Her younger sister Sarah's gentle voice broke the silence in the room. Sarah looked at her sister with concern, fully aware that the sparkle in Claudia's eyes wasn't happiness but resignation. "Yes, I'm ready," Claudia replied with a forced smile, though inside, she felt like an actress in a play she didn't choose to be in. When Sarah left to inform the others, Claudia allowed herself one more moment in front of the mirror. "Why am I doing this?" she asked herself. She knew the answer, even if she didn't want to admit it. She was marrying Anthony, a wealthy older man, not out of love but out of spite. It was a way to escape the pain Adrian had caused her. If he could move on with his life, then so could she, even if it was with a man she didn't love. The sound of wedding music pulled her out of her thoughts. It was time. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, and stepped out of the room, ready to face her new reality. As she walked toward the aisle, the first thing she saw was Anthony waiting for her, serious and dignified in a perfectly tailored black suit. Though his hair had turned gray, he still had a striking presence. His straight posture and unmoving face reflected a man accustomed to controlling everything. Yet, there was something unsettling in his eyes. There was no tenderness or love, only coldness and calculation. But Claudia had known that from the start. This marriage was more of a transaction than a true commitment from the heart. The murmurs of the guests barely reached her. Surrounding her were the smiling faces of family and friends, but everything seemed blurry, as if her mind was trying to block out everything around her. Each step closer to Anthony felt heavier, but there was no turning back. She couldn't back out now. Anthony extended his hand as she approached, and Claudia took it without hesitation. His skin was cold to the touch, and the gentle squeeze felt like a silent warning that this marriage was no fairy tale. "You look beautiful," Anthony whispered without a trace of emotion, as if merely fulfilling an obligation to say so. Claudia just nodded, unsure how to respond. She knew that now, more than ever, she was about to give up the life she once dreamed of. Her eyes scanned the guests, searching for a familiar face, something to connect her to her previous life. And in that moment, her eyes met a man in the back of the room. Gabriel, Anthony's nephew, was watching her from a seat separated from the crowd, with an intense gaze that Claudia couldn't immediately understand. He was younger, perhaps closer to her age than Anthony, and there was something in his expression that made her uneasy. This wasn't the first time they had met. They had briefly crossed paths a few days ago at a family dinner, but the encounter was brief and distant. However, his presence now made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't explain. The priest began the ceremony, and the words echoed in the air like a distant sound to Claudia. She got lost in her own thoughts, in the emptiness that enveloped her. She knew she didn't love Anthony, but she also knew that, in some way, this marriage would bring her stability, something she had grown to appreciate during the painful process of losing Adrian. But at what cost? "Do you take Anthony to be your husband?" The priest's voice pulled Claudia out of her thoughts. She hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and answered with the same coldness she had used when stepping into this relationship. "Yes, I do." The silence inside her contrasted with the applause of the guests. The ritual was complete, Claudia had tied her fate, at least for the time being. As she walked out of the hall hand in hand with Anthony, all eyes were still on them. But the only gaze Claudia truly felt was Gabriel's, who hadn't taken his eyes off her for even a moment. That evening, as the reception continued with shallow conversations and forced congratulations, Claudia tried to play the role of a wife, but the tension in her body was evident each time Gabriel's eyes bore into her. She felt a strange mix of curiosity and something else she couldn't name. Finally, as the night wore on and the guests began to leave, Claudia quietly returned to her room, emotionally drained more than physically. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, exhaling a long breath for the first time all day. Reality had hit her harshly. She had married a man she didn't love for reasons even she couldn't justify. But as her mind sank into exhaustion and confusion, she couldn't stop thinking about Gabriel's image. There was something in his eyes that promised trouble, a silent promise that this marriage would be more complicated than she had thought. The next day, Anthony's house was quieter than usual. The housekeepers were cleaning up the remnants of last night's party, and the sun was just beginning to shine through the large windows of the hall. Claudia, now officially Anthony's wife, woke up feeling strange in the armchair. Last night had been long and exhausting, filled with unfamiliar faces, empty conversations, and the constant feeling of being trapped in a life that didn't belong to her. She slowly stood up, looking around the huge bedroom where she would now have to sleep every night. Everything in Anthony's house was massive and cold, from the high ceilings to the luxurious furniture. It was a home that, despite its opulence, offered no comfort. She stepped out onto the balcony, seeking a breath of fresh air, as if it could cleanse her mind. Looking out at the garden, covered in shadows and rays of sunlight, memories of the previous night returned. She had completed her task of smiling and thanking the guests, playing the perfect wife everyone expected. But throughout the night, one face lingered in her mind, Gabriel. The name Gabriel echoed in her head. The way he had looked at her during the party, distant yet piercing, confused her more than she wanted to admit. It wasn't a casual glance, but a gaze that seemed to strip away her emotions, something even Anthony had not managed to do. Although she knew very little about him, there was something about Gabriel that fascinated her. However, her life was now tied to Anthony, and any thoughts of Gabriel had to be dismissed immediately. He was only her husband's nephew, nothing more. When she went downstairs for breakfast, she found Anthony engrossed in some documents, as if yesterday's wedding was just another event on his busy schedule. He barely looked up to greet her. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, without any real interest in her answer. "Yes, thank you," Claudia replied with a polite smile as she sat down. She noticed Anthony was deeply absorbed in his work and silently wondered if her life would always be like this, beside a man who, despite promising stability, showed no affection at all. Just as the atmosphere was becoming more uncomfortable, the dining room door opened, and Gabriel walked in. His presence immediately changed the room's mood. He was dressed casually, but his confidence and charisma filled the space in a way Claudia hadn't noticed before. "Uncle, may I trouble you for a moment?" Gabriel said, glancing briefly at Claudia before focusing on Anthony. Anthony looked up, seeming slightly annoyed by the interruption, but nodded. "Go ahead, Gabriel, what do you need?" "I just want to confirm the meeting this afternoon. I'd like to review the details before the clients arrive." Gabriel spoke with the calm tone of someone used to handling important matters. Claudia watched the conversation, noting the formality between them. There was no sign of a warm relationship between uncle and nephew. It felt more like an ongoing business transaction. "I'll handle that after breakfast," Anthony replied without losing his composed demeanor, then with a brief gesture, added. "And if you don't mind, Gabriel, I'd like to have a little private time with Claudia before starting the day." Gabriel nodded, but before leaving, his eyes turned to Claudia again. This time, there was no doubt, the look contained something more than mere politeness. It was a curious gaze, as if he was trying to decipher what Claudia was trying to hide. It lasted only a moment, but Claudia felt her heart beat a little faster. Sorry for the interruption, Claudia, Gabriel said with a slight smile before leaving the dining room. As the door closed, silence once again enveloped the room, but this time, the tension was palpable. Claudia tried to focus on her breakfast, but the conflicting emotions that Gabriel stirred in her made it difficult to concentrate. She was aware that something deeper was emerging within her, although she didn't allow herself to pursue those thoughts, at least not yet. Gabriel is very talented, Anthony said suddenly, without taking his eyes off the documents, as if he had read her thoughts. He's young but understands the business well. One day, if he follows in my footsteps, he'll go far. Claudia only nodded, unsure of how to respond. What she knew was that, regardless of how skilled Gabriel was in business, his gaze still unsettled her. It was as if Gabriel carried a layer of mystery that Anthony either didn't see or didn't want to see. The rest of the day passed without any significant events, but Claudia couldn't stop thinking about her brief encounter with Gabriel. His interest didn't seem to be solely about business, and for the first time since getting married, Claudia felt a spark of light inside her, a flicker that both scared and excited her. That afternoon, while wandering through the garden, she heard voices coming from Anthony's study. The door was slightly ajar, and she recognized Gabriel's voice. He was speaking in a low but firm tone, which caught her attention. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure whether to approach, but something inside urged her to listen. "This isn't just about business, Uncle. There's more at stake than you think," Gabriel said, his voice filled with concern. "I know exactly what I'm doing, Gabriel," Anthony replied coldly. "Trust me, everything is under control." Claudia stepped back, her heart pounding. What were they talking about? Curiosity began to grow within her, not just about the family business but also about the relationship between Anthony and Gabriel, and more importantly, her role in all of this. She knew something was being kept from her, something beyond her marriage to Anthony. And although she didn't want to admit it, Gabriel's image lingered in her mind, like a captivating shadow promising to reveal darker secrets she wasn't yet ready to face. With a mix of unease and curiosity, Claudia decided she could no longer ignore these feelings. She didn't know where they would lead her, but something inside told her that the relationship between Gabriel and Anthony was the key to uncovering what was truly going on in her new life. This time, she wouldn't allow herself to be easily trapped. Weeks passed in Anthony's house with the monotony Claudia had begun to dread. The wedding was just the beginning of a life marked by cold, distant luxury, where emotions were pushed to the background. Anthony remained the man she had met, calculating, careful, and always focused on work. But something had changed in Claudia. Even though she had tried to ignore her thoughts and desires, Gabriel's presence had become impossible to overlook. As for Anthony, he seemed either oblivious to this or, if he noticed, he hid it well. He was always busy with meetings with clients, attending social events, or locked in his study. He barely exchanged words with Claudia beyond the necessary polite greetings, and she began to feel that her marriage was nothing more than a performance. One afternoon, while Anthony was attending a meeting, Claudia decided to escape to the garden to get some fresh air. The hours spent inside the house were starting to weigh on her, and the gentle breeze brought at least a temporary sense of relief. She walked along the flower-lined paths, enjoying the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves and the distant chirping of birds. That's when she saw him again, Gabriel, walking toward her from the other end of the garden. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. Every time she saw him, she felt something that went far beyond mere attraction. There was a connection between them that she couldn't deny, even though she knew it was dangerous. "Do you need to escape too?" Gabriel said with a smile, approaching her with the same ease he always showed around the house. Claudia smiled softly but didn't respond right away. She couldn't bring herself to voice what she was starting to feel about him. However, her heart beat faster whenever he was near. "Sometimes I feel like this house is a cage," she finally replied, her voice sounding more fragile than she had intended. Gabriel looked at her for a moment before nodding, as if he understood exactly what she was feeling. He stepped a bit closer and stood next to her, also looking out at the horizon. "You're not the only one who feels that way," he said quietly. Claudia looked at him with curiosity. She knew very little about Gabriel, other than that he was Anthony's nephew and worked with him in the family business. Yet there was something about him, a sadness, or perhaps a hidden frustration, that drew her in. She wanted to know more but was afraid of opening a door she wouldn't be able to close. "It's hard to imagine you feeling trapped. You seem to have everything you want," Claudia remarked, trying to keep her tone casual. Gabriel looked at her for a moment, his expression darkening slightly. "What you see isn't always the truth, Claudia. There are things going on that you can't even begin to imagine." His serious words took her by surprise. It was clear that Gabriel had his own secrets, and the tension between them was becoming more apparent. Before she could ask more, Gabriel shifted the conversation with a faint smile. "Why don't you walk with me? This place is more interesting when you're not wandering alone." Claudia hesitated for a moment but eventually nodded. She knew she shouldn't let this relationship develop beyond mere politeness, but there was something irresistible about Gabriel's presence. They strolled through the gardens together, talking about trivial things, but with each step, the connection between them deepened. What neither of them knew was that from the shadows of a second-floor window, Anthony was watching. He had been noticing the interactions between Claudia and Gabriel for weeks. He had seen the change in his wife's demeanor, the way her eyes lit up a bit when Gabriel was around. None of this surprised Anthony. In fact, he had anticipated it from the moment he decided to marry Claudia. Anthony knew that the attraction between his nephew and his new wife was inevitable. He had seen it even before they did. But rather than feeling betrayed or angry, Anthony saw it as an opportunity. He had been calculating his every move from the beginning. Claudia and Gabriel were just pawns in a larger game they hadn't even begun to suspect. That evening, Anthony decided to approach Claudia in a way he hadn't since the day they got married. When she entered the room after dinner, she found him sitting in an armchair, quietly reading a book. This was rare because he usually spent his evenings in the study. "Is everything all right?" Claudia asked, feeling a bit uneasy with his sudden presence. "I was wondering if we could talk," Anthony said, putting the book aside and standing up as he moved toward her. "Thank you for watching the video all the way through. You are our biggest motivation to keep creating. Let us know where you're watching from so we can see how far this video has reached around the world. Don't forget to hit like if you found it interesting, and share it with your friends too." Claudia looked at him cautiously. Conversations with Anthony were usually brief and to the point, with no room for emotion or personal discussion. "What do you want to talk about?" she replied, trying to keep her tone calm. Anthony stared at her intently for a long moment before he spoke. "I know you feel lonely here, Claudia," he began, his tone soft but carrying an underlying edge. "And I know this probably isn't the marriage you dreamed of, but what I don't want is for you to feel trapped." Anthony's words sounded strange to her. Claudia wasn't sure what he was getting at, but there was something in his tone that made her feel wary. "I'm fine," Claudia lied, though both of them knew that wasn't true. Anthony chuckled lightly, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. "You have Gabriel," he said suddenly, without any pretense. Claudia's heart skipped a beat. The fact that Anthony mentioned Gabriel in that context caught her off guard. What did Anthony know? How much did he know about the relationship she had been developing with his nephew? "I don't understand what you're saying," she said, trying to maintain her composure. Anthony stepped closer, his smile darkening. "You don't have to hide, Claudia. I know you've been spending time with Gabriel. In fact, I encourage it. I want you to feel comfortable here, and if Gabriel can give you something I can't, then so be it." Anthony's words weren't a permission, nor were they a warning, but something more twisted, a meticulously set trap. Claudia stared at him, stunned, unsure how to react. "All I ask is that you stay by my side," Anthony continued, his voice chilling her to the bone. You can enjoy Gabriel's company as much as you like, but remember, this marriage is what matters most. Claudia couldn't believe what she was hearing. It seemed as if Anthony was allowing, even encouraging, her relationship with his nephew, but with conditions she didn't fully understand. Her mind whirled, trying to process what she had just heard, but one thing was clear: Anthony was not the man she thought he was, and their marriage, instead of being just a straightforward arrangement, was part of a darker and more complex plan than she had ever imagined. The next day, after the shocking conversation with Anthony, Claudia sat in the main room of the mansion, watching the afternoon sunlight filter through the windows. Days had passed since that disturbing talk, but the feeling of unease still weighed heavily in her chest. Her husband knew about her relationship with Gabriel, and not only did he know, but he also twistedly encouraged it. But why? That was the question that haunted her. Anthony's behavior was too strange. There was no sign of jealousy or resentment. On the contrary, he seemed to be controlling every situation, every emotion, as if he was moving pieces on a chessboard. Claudia couldn't shake the feeling that there was something behind his apparent indifference. She began to suspect that she was being used, but she didn't know how or for what purpose. The sound of footsteps approaching pulled her out of her thoughts. When she turned around, she saw Gabriel entering the room with his usual calm demeanor. The air grew heavier as their eyes met. Claudia felt the tension between them growing stronger, as if both of them knew a certain truth was waiting to be revealed. "I need to talk to you," Gabriel said softly, stopping a few steps away from her. Claudia nodded. She had been thinking about him ever since their last conversation in the garden. Something had changed between them. It was no longer just simple attraction or curiosity. Now, there was an invisible barrier, a mix of suspicion and repressed emotions. "There's something I need to know, Gabriel," Claudia began, her voice more resolute than even she expected. "What's going on between you and Anthony? What are you hiding from me?" The question hung in the air, creating an uncomfortable silence. Gabriel looked at her with a blend of hesitation and resignation. He knew he couldn't keep hiding the truth, but he also feared the consequences of revealing it. "Claudia, there are things that you won't easily understand," he finally said, his voice tense. "This is bigger than you think, bigger than anything we could imagine." Claudia crossed her arms, frustration growing inside her. "Stop trying to protect me with lies. I know Anthony is deceiving me, and I know you're involved in this too. Just tell me the truth." Gabriel let out a deep sigh, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of anxiety. "All right, you deserve to know the truth," he relented, his tone gentler. "But you have to promise me you won't do anything reckless. What's at stake here is much bigger than you can imagine." Claudia stared at him, unblinking. "Tell me," she insisted. Gabriel hesitated before speaking, as if carefully choosing each word. "Anthony isn't just the businessman you think he is. He's been involved in a lot of dark dealings his entire life, and what he wants most is to maintain control over everything and everyone around him. That control is what keeps him in a position of power." Claudia frowned, confused. She knew Anthony was cold and calculating, but she had never imagined he was involved in such dark affairs as Gabriel was implying. "So, how am I involved in all of this?" she asked, dreading the answer. Gabriel looked at her sadly, knowing his words would hurt her. "You're part of his plan, Claudia. He chose you on purpose. Your marriage to him wasn't a spontaneous decision, it was part of a strategy. There are people in Anthony's past, enemies who have betrayed him, and you happen to be connected to one of them." Claudia felt the world around her collapse. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to comprehend what Gabriel had just said. How could she be connected to Anthony's enemies? Everything she believed about her marriage, about her life, was starting to fall apart. "Who?" she asked, her voice so soft it was almost inaudible. Gabriel stepped closer, his face full of regret. "Your father, Claudia. Anthony and he were involved in business deals that didn't end well. Your father was part of a group that betrayed Anthony years ago, and ever since then, he's been looking for revenge. And you were the perfect way for him to bring those ghosts from the past back. The pain Claudia felt was overwhelming. Her father. She had always believed her father was a simple man who had worked hard to support their family, someone completely unrelated to power struggles. And now she was finding out that she had been used as a tool in Anthony's revenge. Tears welled up, but Claudia held them back, not allowing them to fall. She couldn't show weakness now. She needed to be strong, even if everything inside her was breaking. "And you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Did you know about this from the start? Are you part of this game too?" Gabriel quickly shook his head, taking another step closer to her. "No, Claudia. At first, I didn't know what Anthony was planning. All I knew was that he was very angry about the past and the people who betrayed him. But I never imagined that you were involved until it was too late." Claudia looked at him, trying to read every expression on his face, searching for signs of deceit or manipulation, but she only saw sincerity. However, that didn't lessen the pain within her. Gabriel, even unintentionally, had been a part of Anthony's manipulation. "I want to help you," he said, his voice filled with desperation. "I don't want you to be a part of this anymore. I want to get you out of here, but you have to trust me." Gabriel's words echoed in her head, but Claudia no longer knew who to trust. She felt utterly alone in this cruel game, manipulated by everyone around her. Anthony had built a web in which she was just another pawn. And although Gabriel claimed to want to protect her, he was still a part of that chessboard. "I don't know if I can trust you, Gabriel," Claudia confessed, the weight of sadness heavy on her chest. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore." Gabriel lowered his head, burdened by guilt. He knew there was nothing he could say to ease Claudia's pain. She had been betrayed in the worst way, and he was a part of it, even if unintentionally. The silence between them was broken by a gentle knock on the door. Both of them quickly turned, and Claudia's heart nearly stopped when she saw Anthony standing at the doorway, quietly observing them. "Am I interrupting something?" Anthony asked with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Claudia felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew Anthony had heard enough, but she had no idea how he would react. The hours following Claudia's discovery of the truth were a storm of emotions. Her mind kept replaying Gabriel's words, revealing that her marriage to Anthony was part of a dark revenge plan. The connection between her father and Anthony, the manipulation she had endured, and the betrayal hidden in every gesture and glance from the two men around her had left her shaken. After Anthony's unexpected appearance in the living room, Gabriel quietly left, not wanting to add to the tension. As for Anthony, he acted as if he hadn't heard anything, maintaining his usual calm demeanor. But Claudia knew that everything was shifting, that Anthony's pieces were moving, and somehow, she was still one of them. That night, Claudia wandered the halls of the mansion alone, unable to sleep. She felt the weight of everything she had learned, and above all, the guilt that was beginning to grow inside her. Even though she knew the truth, she couldn't deny her feelings for Gabriel. He was part of the deception, but she sensed sincerity in his intentions. That didn't stop the dark cloud of doubt from hovering over every thought she had about him. She stepped into the library, the only place where she could be alone with her thoughts. The shelves were filled with books, the faint scent of old paper lingered, and the quiet of the night provided a temporary refuge, but it couldn't calm the storm of emotions raging inside her. She sat down in an armchair, hugging herself as if seeking protection. "Are you all right?" Anthony's voice broke the silence. He stood at the door with his familiar calm expression, but Claudia knew that nothing he did or said was accidental. Anthony always had a hidden motive, a plan he always followed, no matter the circumstances. "I couldn't sleep," Claudia replied, trying to sound more composed than she felt. Anthony walked over and sat down in the chair opposite her, quietly observing her before he spoke. "What I told you the other night, I want you to know that I'm willing to give you what you need, Claudia," he said with a softness that made her more uneasy than comforted. I don't want you to feel trapped. If Gabriel makes you feel alive, I have no problem with that. What matters most is that we maintain the appearance of this relationship. Our marriage isn't just an emotional bond, it's an alliance. Claudia looked at him in silence, trying to decipher his true intentions. Every word Anthony said carried multiple meanings, and now more than ever, she realized that he was always in control. But what worried her most was her own reaction to what Anthony was saying. She should have felt relieved at the thought of being able to see Gabriel without worrying about the consequences, but instead, all she felt was a deep sense of regret. "How can you say these things so easily?" she whispered, unable to control herself. "Don't you care about anything other than maintaining control?" Anthony smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "What I care about is protecting what I've built, Claudia. We're not children playing with emotions. What we do here has consequences that reach far beyond our personal lives. But if you feel guilty for being close to Gabriel, maybe you should ask yourself what you're truly looking for." Anthony's words left her frozen. He wasn't just manipulating the situation, he was encouraging her to continue her relationship with Gabriel, as if it was all part of his plan. Claudia clenched her hands in her lap, feeling the weight of a decision she had never wanted to make. Could she continue to let Anthony control her, even after knowing the truth? "I won't play your game," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. Anthony stared at her, as if analyzing every word she said, then without another word, he stood up. "The choice is yours, Claudia, but don't forget that every step you take has consequences," he warned before walking out of the room. When the library door closed, Claudia finally felt her body begin to relax, but her mind was still in turmoil. What had she become? She was being drawn into the schemes of a man who saw her as nothing more than a tool. And the hardest part to accept was that her feelings for Gabriel, amidst all this chaos, were genuine. Later, as the night grew darker, Claudia wandered into the mansion's garden, trying to calm her mind. The cool night air brushed gently against her skin, but the guilt in her chest didn't fade. As she walked along the flower-lined path, she encountered Gabriel. He looked as restless as she did. When he saw her, he quickly approached but kept a careful distance. "Claudia, I don't want you to feel this way," he said, recognizing the pain on her face. "What's happening between us isn't a mistake. You shouldn't blame yourself for it." Claudia looked at him, tears welling up in her eyes. She knew her feelings for him weren't just a fleeting attraction, but the circumstances made her doubt everything. "You don't understand, Gabriel. I feel like I'm being pulled into something I can't control. And even though my feelings for you are real, I can't ignore the guilt that's eating me up." Gabriel lowered his head, clearly sharing in Claudia's frustration. He knew that everything happening was the result of Anthony's manipulation, and they were both trapped in a dangerous game. He wanted to help her, but he didn't know how. "You're not the only one who feels trapped," he whispered. "My life has been under Anthony's control for years. Everything I do, every decision I make, always seems to be influenced by his shadow. But my feelings for you, that's the one thing that belongs to me, Claudia, the one thing Anthony can't control." Gabriel's words echoed within her, but the regret remained, like a wound that couldn't heal. No matter what, she still felt she was betraying not just Anthony, but herself. She had entered this marriage out of anger, but she had never imagined her life would be caught in a web of lies, deceit, and manipulation. "I don't know if I can keep going like this," Claudia finally admitted. "I feel like I'm losing control of my life, and I don't know how to stop it." Gabriel stepped closer to her, but this time he didn't touch her. Instead, he looked at her with that same intense gaze from the first time they met. "You don't need to decide right now, Claudia. I just want you to know that I'm here, and I won't let Anthony destroy you." Claudia nodded slightly, but doubt still clung to her. Gabriel was being sincere, she knew that. But something bigger than them both was looming, threatening to overwhelm them. Anthony wouldn't let his plan collapse easily, and the shadow of what was to come continued to haunt her. The night grew darker, but the path Claudia had to take remained unclear. The guilt she felt over her emotions for Gabriel burned within her, but deep down, she knew something had to change. She couldn't continue living under the control of a man who saw her as nothing more than a pawn in his game. As Gabriel walked away, leaving her alone under the starry sky, Claudia wondered if she would ever truly escape the trap that had been set for her. The next morning, the atmosphere in the mansion was heavier than usual. Claudia sat in the dining room, watching Anthony coldly skim through a few stacks of papers while sipping his coffee. Since their conversation the previous night, something had shifted inside her. She knew she couldn't continue being a puppet in her husband's game, but she still didn't know how to break free from the web he had spun. As she watched Anthony, a feeling of unease stirred in her chest. There was something strange about his behavior this morning. Although he was always methodical and calculating, today he seemed more focused on his work, almost as if he were preparing for the next move in his plan. "Would you like to go out this afternoon?" Anthony asked abruptly, without looking up from his documents. Claudia looked at him in surprise. Anthony rarely suggested anything unrelated to business or maintaining social appearances. "Where to?" she responded cautiously. Anthony smiled lightly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "I thought we could visit one of the family vineyards. It's quiet there, perfect for clearing the mind." His tone seemed normal, almost relaxed, but Claudia couldn't help noticing an underlying tension in his invitation. Something about this suggestion didn't sit right with her. Throughout their marriage, Anthony had always maintained an emotional distance, only concerned with his plans. Now, suddenly, he was being kind, after encouraging her to pursue a relationship with Gabriel, as if he were trying to distract her, to pull her away from the center of the scheming. Cautious as ever, Claudia decided to play along, though her suspicion that Anthony was hiding something grew stronger. "All right," Claudia replied, forcing a smile. "Maybe that's a good idea." The afternoon came, and as the car drove them out of the city, the silence between them became suffocating. Anthony stared out the window, seemingly lost in his own thoughts, while Claudia couldn't stop wondering about the real reason behind this sudden trip. Her anxiety grew with every mile they traveled. Finally, they arrived at the vineyard, a vast expanse of grapevines stretching out to the horizon. It was a beautiful place, but for Claudia, it represented a troubling quiet in the power struggle she didn't fully understand. As they walked through the rows of vines, Anthony began to speak, but what he said wasn't what Claudia expected. "Many years ago, before I met your father, this vineyard was my sanctuary," he began, his tone more personal than usual. "It's where I came when work or the betrayals of others suffocated me. Here, I could think clearly." Claudia listened in silence, puzzled by the turn of the conversation. Anthony rarely talked about his past, let alone anything personal. "It was here that I made some of the most important decisions of my life," Anthony continued, his eyes fixed on the gently swaying vines. "Decisions that made me who I am today and, ultimately, decisions that led me to you." Claudia looked at him, her heart racing. She knew Anthony never confessed anything without a reason. Whatever he was revealing now certainly had a purpose, and it was likely not to help her understand him better. He was setting something up. "When your father and I met, I learned that not every man is trustworthy," Anthony said, his tone now colder. "Some people seek to destroy what others build, no matter the cost. Your father was one of those people." Claudia felt a lump form in her throat. The connection between her father and Anthony, which she had only recently discovered, was now being revealed as a dark chapter in her family's history. But the most painful part was the cold way Anthony spoke about it, as if people were just pieces in his game. "He betrayed me," Anthony continued, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "And I knew that one day, I would have to settle the score. When I met you, Claudia, I saw the perfect opportunity to do that." The bluntness in his voice sent a chill down Claudia's spine. There was no longer any doubt, her marriage had been part of a revenge plan from the start. Anthony hadn't chosen her out of love or even care, but to settle an old score. So that's all this was? Claudia asked, her voice trembling. You married me just to get revenge for something that happened years ago, to punish my family? Anthony turned to look at her, his cold, calculating smile sending another shiver through her. Claudia, not everything is as black and white as you think. Yes, marrying you was a way to ensure that your father paid for what he did. But I also did it because I knew it was what was best for both of us. With you by my side, my revenge has more weight, more meaning. Claudia took a step back, overwhelmed by what she had just heard. Anthony's manipulation was deeper than she had ever imagined. Her entire life, from the moment she met him, had been a lie. And Gabriel? Claudia asked, her voice shaking. Are you using him in your plan too? Anthony raised an eyebrow, as if the question was naive to him. Gabriel has his own role in all of this, but his involvement wasn't deliberate. In fact, his attraction to you was an unexpected advantage. Claudia felt her stomach twist. Everything she had experienced, all the emotions, the feelings for Gabriel, were all part of a plan that Anthony had orchestrated from the beginning. Her life was a cage, and there was no way out. Why are you telling me all of this now? Claudia asked, trying to keep her composure. Because it no longer matters whether you know or not, Anthony replied, his voice colder than ever. The pieces are already in place. I just want you to understand that there's nothing you can do to change that. Claudia looked at him, a sense of despair welling up inside her. Anthony had planned everything, and now he was flaunting his power without a hint of remorse. The vineyard, the conversation, it was all part of a carefully calculated moment to reveal his ruthless manipulation. But as Anthony continued to speak, something inside Claudia shifted. She was no longer the woman who had entered this marriage out of anger. Now she understood the true face of Anthony, and she knew she couldn't continue to be a passive victim. She would have to find a way to fight back, even if she didn't know where to begin. As the sun set behind the hills, Claudia realized she was alone in her battle. But she also knew that, somehow, she had to find the strength to break Anthony's game. Night had fallen by the time Claudia and Anthony returned to the mansion. Though they hadn't spoken throughout the drive, the silence between them spoke volumes more than any conversation could. Claudia, still processing Anthony's revelations, knew that something had to change. She couldn't continue living under the control of a man who saw her as a tool in his plan for revenge. But the question kept repeating in her mind, how could she escape someone like Anthony, who always seemed to be one step ahead? When they arrived, Anthony quickly retreated to his study, leaving her alone in the grand foyer. The mansion was dark and silent, as if even the walls sensed that something was about to collapse. Claudia knew she couldn't keep all of this inside forever. She needed answers, and despite the conflicted feelings she had for Gabriel, he was the only person she could speak to honestly. She hurried up the stairs, heading toward the wing where Gabriel usually stayed. When she reached his door, she hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding. Uncertainty and fear battled within her, but there was also a growing determination. Finally, she knocked softly. "Come in," Gabriel's deep voice called from the other side of the door. Claudia stepped inside and found him sitting by the window, his eyes lost in the darkness outside. The dim light illuminated his face, revealing an expression of fatigue and worry. When he saw her, Gabriel quickly stood up, surprised by her presence. "Claudia, what's going on?" he asked, his voice full of concern as he noticed the distress on her face. "I need to know the truth," she said bluntly, stepping closer to him. "I can't keep living like this. Anthony has revealed part of his plan, but I feel like there's still so much I don't understand. And you, Gabriel, I don't know if I can trust you." Gabriel frowned, clearly affected by Claudia's words. He knew the moment of truth had come, and although he had tried to protect her from the worst of it, he couldn't hide the truth any longer. "Claudia," he began, his voice heavy. "What Anthony is doing is darker than you can imagine. I never wanted you to be caught up in this. Claudia moved closer, her eyes filled with anger and pain. What do you mean, Gabriel? What role do you play in all of this? Because ever since I met you, everything has been a whirlwind of emotions and secrets. I want to know if you're using me. Gabriel looked at her deeply, feeling the weight of guilt pressing down on him. He stepped toward her but stopped just before touching her, acutely aware of the barrier between them. I'm not deceiving you, Claudia, he said, his voice strained. My feelings for you are real. They have been real from the start. But it's true, I've been trapped in Anthony's damn game. Claudia searched his face, trying to determine if she could believe him. The man standing before her was not the cold, calculating figure she had once thought. There was something about his vulnerability that made her want to let her guard down. But she wasn't ready to lower her defenses just yet. Anthony has been using me, Gabriel continued. At first, I thought he just wanted to control the family business. But soon, I realized his intentions were much deeper. It's all about getting revenge for what your father did. Anthony has controlled me for years, forcing me to follow his orders. Claudia felt a lump rise in her throat, her heart pounding as she processed what he was saying. Controlled how? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Gabriel lowered his gaze, his face tightening under the weight of the truth. My mother. Anthony has power over her. She's the reason I agreed to be part of his scheme in the first place. I knew that if I didn't do what he wanted, he would ruin her. She's very sick and needs constant care. Anthony has the resources and means to provide for her, but in return, he forced me to stay by his side and carry out his plans. Claudia stepped back, overwhelmed by the extent of Anthony's manipulation. Now she understood why Gabriel always seemed trapped, why there was so much pain in his eyes. He had been compelled to follow his uncle's orders to protect his mother. Gabriel, Claudia began, her voice trembling with sympathy. I didn't know. I don't need you to understand, Gabriel interrupted, his voice bitter. But now you know. Anthony used me to get close to you, to turn me into another pawn in his revenge game. He thought that if I got closer to you, everything would be easier to control. And by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. I had fallen in love with you, Claudia, and that was never part of the plan. Gabriel's final words caused the air in the room to freeze. Claudia looked at him, emotions flooding through her. She felt the weight of her love for Gabriel, but also the pain of betrayal, knowing that everything had begun as part of a cruel game. What do we do now? She asked, her voice a mix of desperation and hope. Anthony won't stop. He's trapped both of us. Gabriel looked at her with a determination she hadn't seen in him before. He stepped closer. It doesn't have to be that way, he said, stepping even closer. We can't keep playing by his rules. We need to find a way to get out of this game before it's too late. And I won't let him destroy you. Claudia felt a glimmer of hope in Gabriel's words, but she knew it wouldn't be that simple. Anthony was not the type to give up, and escaping his control would not be easy. But how? Claudia's voice was shaky. How can we get out of this? Gabriel moved closer, finally taking her hand, his eyes reflecting a mixture of sadness and determination. First, we need information. We have to understand all of Anthony's moves before we do anything. He has many connections, but he also has weaknesses. I know a few people who might be able to help us find out what he's really planning. But the most important thing is that we can't let Anthony know we're working together. Claudia nodded slowly. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but the idea of an escape, of resisting Anthony's control, had lit a small spark of hope within her. We fight together, Gabriel, she said, feeling the strength in her own words. I won't let Anthony keep manipulating us. Gabriel nodded, and they both understood that the path ahead was full of danger. But in that moment, they felt a solidarity that Claudia hadn't felt since this all began. She had someone by her side, someone willing to fight for her, someone ready to risk everything. But the danger was not just in what Anthony could do. Both Claudia and Gabriel knew that revenge, once set in motion, was like a train that couldn't easily be stopped, and now both of them were on that train, awaiting the inevitable crash. The days after her conversation with Gabriel were filled with unease and plans. With renewed determination, Claudia began observing Anthony's every move, searching for signs of cracks in his outward control. The idea of escaping his influence still seemed distant, but she no longer felt powerless. Now she had Gabriel by her side, and that brought a glimmer of hope in the darkness surrounding her. That morning, sitting in the dining room, Claudia looked out through the large windows into the garden. The rays of sunlight filtering through the curtains reminded her that, even though her life seemed shrouded in darkness, the world outside continued to turn. She knew Anthony was attending an important meeting with some partners, and for the next few hours, the mansion would be free of his presence. This was the perfect moment to move forward with their plan. Gabriel had mentioned a few people who could help them gather crucial information about Anthony's business relationships and his partners. There was a group of partners, although loyal to Anthony, who had their own agendas. However, before taking any action, they needed evidence, something they could use to weaken Anthony from the inside. Claudia stood up, her mind focused on an idea that had been haunting her for days: Anthony's private documents. She knew he kept highly confidential files in his study, contracts and agreements with people of questionable reputations. If she could get access to them, she might find something strong enough to challenge her husband's empire. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Anthony's study was a fortress, always locked and protected by the confidence that no one would dare to cross his boundaries. But Claudia was no longer the frightened woman she was when she married him. Anthony's betrayal, the discovery of his revenge plan, and the pain of being used had changed her. She was ready to risk everything to reclaim her freedom. She made her way to the study, making sure no staff were around. She had seen the key hidden in a drawer in the living room before. She knew Anthony would never expect her to dare do this, which gave her an advantage. She found the key exactly where it had always been, and with her heart pounding, she headed straight to the study. When the door opened, Claudia felt a chill run down her spine. Anthony's study was neatly arranged with dark furniture and a massive bookshelf full of books he had probably never read. In the center, the large mahogany desk, witness to countless transactions, was the target of her search. She closed the door behind her and approached the desk, her hands trembling as she tried to stay calm. She knew she had to be quick but also careful. Any mistake could lead to her being caught. She began to rummage through the drawers, one by one, looking for something she could use against him. Papers, contracts, transfer documents, all seemed normal on the surface, but Claudia knew that Anthony's true darkness was hidden within these documents. When she opened the last drawer, she found a file thicker than the rest. As she pulled it out, she noticed a name written on the cover: Rodriguez, her father's surname. The knot in her stomach tightened. She knew she was about to uncover something that could change everything. Slowly, she opened the file and began to read. What she found inside was far beyond what she had expected. They were detailed documents about an old partnership between Anthony and her father. But what shocked her most was that, according to these papers, her father had tried to withdraw from Anthony and the shady deals they were involved in. Claudia had always thought her father was guilty of betraying Anthony, but these documents pointed to the opposite. It was Anthony who had deceived her father, manipulating the situation to take a significant share of his assets. Claudia felt a mix of rage and pain stirring inside her. Her father had been another victim of Anthony's schemes, just like she was. And now, she held in her hands the evidence that could destroy him. "What are you doing in here?" Anthony's cold voice echoed from the doorway. Claudia turned around suddenly, her heart leaping into her throat. Anthony stood in the doorway, looking at her with a mix of surprise and anger. Clearly, he hadn't expected to find her rummaging through his study. "Claudia," his voice was low but full of warning. "Put that file down and step away." Claudia looked at him, feeling the weight of this decision in every fiber of her being. She knew this was a defining moment. Either she would back down and continue being the woman he controlled, or she would stand her ground with the strength she had gathered and face whatever came next. "Not anymore," Claudia said, surprising even herself with the firmness in her voice. "I can't keep pretending, Anthony. I know what you've done, not just to my father but to me. And I won't let you keep manipulating me." Anthony stepped closer, his face hardening. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," he warned. "What you're doing is dangerous. You know you can't win this game, Claudia." Stay tuned for part 2. Comment number 2 if you want to see part 2. We will keep you posted.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.